When did following school rules become more important than saving your life? I was 3 bites into my turkey sandwich when my throat started tingling. Not the normal kind of tingle you get from spicy food, but that specific electric feeling I'd learned to recognize over 16 years of living with a severe peanut allergy. My hands went cold and I dropped the sandwich onto my lunch tray, while my best friend Autumn looked up from her phone with concern spreading across her face. "Something's wrong," I managed to say before my voice started sounding weird and thick like my tongue was swelling. She grabbed my water bottle and shoved it at me, but swallowing felt wrong, like there was something blocking my airway that shouldn't be there. I could feel my pulse hammering in my neck and my skin was getting hot and itchy all over, that familiar crawling sensation that meant my immune system was going haywire. The cafeteria noise seemed to get louder and more distant at the same time while I tried to remember the emergency protocol my allergist had drilled into me since I was 6 years old. My EpiPen was in my locker on the 3rd floor in the science wing, exactly where school policy required me to keep it, because medications weren't allowed in backpacks or pockets during school hours. The nurse's office had a backup, but that was on the opposite side of the building past the main entrance. Autumn was already standing up and pulling out her phone to call for help when the fire alarm exploded through the cafeteria speakers with that piercing electronic shriek that made everyone jump. The whole room erupted into chaos with chairs scraping and trays clattering as 300 students started moving toward the exits like they'd done in dozens of drills before. Mrs. Kovacs, the history teacher on lunch duty, was already at the cafeteria doors waving her arms and shouting for everyone to line up single file and move quickly to the parking lot assembly point. I tried to stand, but my legs felt shaky and wrong, and when I touched my face, my lips were already swelling. Autumn grabbed my arm and started pulling me toward Mrs. Kovacs while yelling that I was having an allergic reaction and needed my EpiPen from my locker. Mrs. Kovacs' face went tight when she saw us approaching instead of following the crowd outside, and she held up both hands like a traffic cop stopping cars at an intersection. "Everyone out now," she said in that sharp voice teachers use when they're not accepting arguments. "No exceptions. This is a fire emergency." Autumn tried to explain about the EpiPen and my allergy, but Mrs. Kovacs was already shaking her head before the words were fully out. "Fire protocol supersedes all other concerns," she said, and I watched her eyes flick to the security camera in the corner of the cafeteria like she was aware of being recorded. I could feel my throat closing more with each breath, this horrible tightening sensation like someone was slowly twisting a belt around my neck from the inside. "The locker is the other direction," I tried to say, but my voice came out as a wheeze that barely sounded human. Mrs. Kovacs stepped closer, and I could see genuine concern flicker across her face before she covered it with that professional teacher mask. "I understand you're scared," she said in a softer tone, "but fire drills don't stop for medical excuses because people die in fires when we don't follow protocol." She put her hand on my shoulder and started guiding me firmly toward the exit doors, where the last struggling students were disappearing into the bright afternoon sunlight. Autumn was arguing now, her voice getting higher and more desperate, saying that I was going into anaphylactic shock and would die without the EpiPen in the next few minutes. Mrs. Kovacs' jaw set in that stubborn way adults get when they've decided they know better than teenagers, and she said the paramedics could treat me outside where it was safe from fire danger, but right now we needed to evacuate immediately, because that's what the law required during a fire alarm. My vision was starting to tunnel at the edges, everything getting dimmer except for the bright rectangle of the exit door that Mrs. Kovacs was pushing me toward. I tried to dig my heels into the linoleum floor, but my legs weren't coordinating properly anymore and I stumbled forward instead. Behind me I heard Autumn yell something about getting the EpiPen herself, and when I managed to turn my head, I saw her sprinting in the opposite direction toward the science wing stairwell. Mrs. Kovacs shouted after her to stop immediately, but Autumn was already gone around the corner. We made it outside into the parking lot where students were gathering in their designated assembly areas by grade level, and the fresh air should have helped, but my breathing was getting worse instead of better. I sank down onto the asphalt and pressed my hands against my throat like I could physically hold my airway open through willpower alone. Mrs. Kovacs was on her radio calling for the school nurse while students started noticing something was wrong and forming a circle around us. I could hear their voices but couldn't process the actual words anymore, just a wash of concerned sounds that seemed to be coming from underwater. My lips felt huge and numb, and when I touched them with shaking fingers, they were swollen to probably twice their normal size. The itching sensation had spread to my scalp and down my arms, and I wanted to scratch at my skin until it came off, but my hands weren't cooperating with my brain's commands anymore. The world tilted sideways and I realized I was falling, my cheek hitting the warm asphalt while someone screamed. Through my narrowing vision, I could see Mrs. Kovacs' shoes and the bottom of her khaki pants, and beyond that, the crowd of students with their phones out recording everything because that's what teenagers do when something dramatic happens. Inside the building, Autumn was sprinting up the science wing stairs 3 at a time with her heart pounding and her breath coming in gasps. She'd been on the track team since freshman year, but she'd never run this fast in her life because she'd never been running to save someone's life before. The hallways were completely empty since everyone else had evacuated, and the silence was eerie after the chaos of the cafeteria. She reached the 3rd floor and turned left toward my locker, her shoes squeaking on the polished floor. She was fumbling with her phone to call me for my locker combination when she heard heavy footsteps behind her getting rapidly closer. Security Officer Whitmore rounded the corner at a run, his face red and his radio squawking with voices demanding status updates on the rogue student who'd violated evacuation protocol. Autumn tried to explain while still running toward my locker, but Whitmore was already shouting at her to stop and put her hands up. She ignored him and kept going, scanning the locker numbers until she found 3847, my locker. She spun the combination lock with shaking hands, messing up the sequence twice before getting it right on the 3rd try. The metal door swung open just as Whitmore reached her, and she saw my backpack hanging on the hook inside with the bright orange EpiPen case clipped to the front pocket exactly where I always kept it. She grabbed for it, but Whitmore's hand closed around her wrist in a grip that would leave bruises. She tried to twist away while explaining that I was dying in the parking lot from anaphylaxis, but he wasn't listening, just reciting school policy about evacuation procedures and how violating them during a fire emergency was grounds for suspension and possible criminal charges for endangering other students. Autumn did something then that surprised both of them, because she'd never been in a fight before in her entire life. She brought her knee up hard into Whitmore's stomach, and when his grip loosened in shock and pain, she yanked the EpiPen case free and ran. She could hear him cursing and his radio crackling behind her as she sprinted back toward the stairs, but she had a head start and the element of surprise. The stairs seemed endless going down, her legs burning and her lungs screaming, but she pushed harder because every second counted when someone was in anaphylactic shock. She burst through the ground floor exit doors into the parking lot where the entire school population was assembled, and she could see the crowd gathered around someone on the ground near the sophomore assembly area. She ran toward it, weaving between clusters of students who stepped aside when they saw her face. Out in the parking lot, I'd stopped breathing about 30 seconds before. My airway had swollen completely shut, and my lips had turned from red to blue to a grayish color that made several students turn away or start crying. Mrs. Kovacs was trying to perform CPR, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely maintain the rhythm. The school nurse had arrived with her medical bag and was frantically searching for something while shouting at Mrs. Kovacs to keep going. Someone was screaming for an ambulance. Multiple people, actually, their voices blending together into a chorus of panic. The crowd had swollen to maybe 200 students now, all watching with their phones out, and some of them would later post the videos on social media despite explicit instructions not to. My face was gray and puffy and didn't look human anymore, and my body was completely limp against the asphalt. Autumn broke through the crowd and dropped to her knees next to me, her hands fumbling with the EpiPen case. The school nurse saw what she had and grabbed it from her, popping the case open and pulling out the auto-injector with practiced efficiency that came from years of training. She jerked up the leg of my jeans and pressed the orange tip against my outer thigh hard enough to leave a mark, and the spring-loaded needle punched through fabric and skin with a click that seemed impossibly loud. She held it there for a count of 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours, and everyone in the circle watched my face for any sign of improvement. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Mrs. Kovacs' CPR compressions faltered as she stared at my unchanged expression. Then my chest jerked once, twice, and I sucked in a rasping breath that sounded like gravel being dragged across metal. The crowd erupted in relieved sounds that were part cheer and part sob, but the school nurse wasn't celebrating yet. She had her fingers pressed to my neck checking my pulse, and was barking orders at Mrs. Kovacs to keep me on my side in recovery position. My breathing was still labored and my face was still swollen, but air was moving through my damaged throat again, which meant I might actually survive this. The nurse was on her radio calling for the ambulance status, and dispatch was telling her 8 minutes out because the fire trucks blocking all the streets around the school were making it impossible for the ambulance to get through. 8 minutes might as well be 8 hours when someone's airway is compromised, and the nurse was already pulling out a secondary EpiPen from her medical bag just in case my symptoms rebounded before the paramedics arrived. She kept talking to me in a calm, steady voice, asking me to squeeze her hand if I could hear her, but I couldn't make my fingers work yet. Inside the school building, Principal Winters was standing in the main office staring at the security monitors showing the scene in the parking lot. He'd been watching since the moment Mrs. Kovacs had radioed about a student in medical distress, and he'd seen everything unfold with growing horror. The fire alarm control panel on the wall next to him showed the trigger point for the alarm had been a manual pull station in the East Wing boys' bathroom, which meant this wasn't a real fire but a false alarm that someone had deliberately set off. He'd gotten confirmation of that about 90 seconds after the alarm started, which meant he could have given the all-clear immediately and let students return to the building where medical supplies were accessible. But the district policy was crystal clear about completing full evacuation and sweep protocols, even for confirmed false alarms, because liability attorneys had written the rules after